Hello, my name is Hyungjun Jun and my presentation is on the Chicago School. These are the four sections that I will be talking about. First, I'll introduce the background of the Chicago School. Next, I'll be summarizing the reading. Then, I'll explain through the use of models and visuals. And finally, I'll finish this presentation by talking about the media of today. Alright, so the theory introduction. In the early periods, people called the newspaper as Tribune of the People, Fourth Estate, the Palladium of civil liberties. In the early time period, people did not have access to mobile and other communication devices, which made them rely solely on the newspaper for information. Therefore, what was written on the newspaper was extremely important. Although Chicago started out as just a small town in the early part of the 19th century, by 1890 the population reached 1 million, and by 1930 the population reached 3 million. Chicago later became the center of learning and culture as the city thrived. Chicago became the center of study in 1920 with the urbanization and immigration. The Polish peasant in Europe was the first significant work of Chicago. One of the most prominent figures of the Chicago School was Robert E. Park. Park played a key role in the development of empirical research at the Chicago School. Park is known to be a part of a great social movement for the investigation of human societies. One of Park's greatest feats is publishing The City, which eventually became highly influential and served to be the groundwork of sociological research on cities, including Chicago. Park's perspective on the world is highly influential even in the present day. Now, moving on to the book reading. The first newspaper in America was called the Boston Newsletter. During this time period, the newspaper was generally published by the postmaster, who dwelled in the village post office that served to be a public forum. In the beginning, the newspaper served only to be a device for organizing gossips. They were more focused on forming a picturesque or romantic incidents to attract the readers. In addition, they based their ideas on village institution. As shown in this diagram, the village post office went through the postmaster and the editor, who then passed it on to the villagers. This is similar to present-day gatekeeping, which will be talked about later on in this presentation. The public was most concerned about the reports of the debates in Parliament. Reporters used indirect ways to obtain information about the conversation in Parliament. The character of parliamentary government was significantly influenced by reporters. Newspapers enabled the public to indirectly participate in the discussions of Parliament. The U.S. inherited English parliamentary government thus reenacted the role of the political journals, and the Journal of Opinion reached its pinnacle under Horace Greeley, the editor of New York Tribune, during the anti-slavery struggle. As cities grew, politics became sophisticated, and so did newspapers. As political machines developed, independent newspapers began to rise. Example is New York Times. Rise of independent newspapers caused papers to break away from their parties. And power in the press shifted from editorial writers to the news and its reporters. The concept of party press and the independent press is also covered in the reading, and specifically, the independent press grew to respond to the party press, which was becoming more and more biased. The independent press had no side, while the party press wrote for their own parties. The newspaper was the only means of communication during the 19th century when telephone and automobiles were not developed. Therefore, knowing the interest of the readers was very important. And in the yellow press, the writers believed that love and romance are interest of topics for women, and sports and politics were for men. And in the yellow press, there were two main figures, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Joseph Pulitzer was the editor of St. Louis Post-Dispatch and was the inventor of muckraking. Muckraking allowed paper to become the most circulated newspaper in New York City. Another prominent figure is William Randolph Hearst. He worked in San Francisco and succeeded with his own newspaper, The Examiner. After his career in San Francisco, he moved to New York where he would start the New York Journal. He considered the newspaper as a form of entertainment. To basically sum up the reading, this is the growth of newspaper. From early newspaper to the modern newspaper went through a lot of change. However, its main purpose has not changed and is still a means of communication. One of the key concepts that are not mentioned in the reading is the concentric zone model. This is also known as the Burgess model and is known to be one of the earliest theoretical models to explain urban social structures. This was an important theory which helped researchers develop theories related to communication. Another important theory that contributed to the growth of society is the social disorganizational theory. This was developed by the Chicago School. Basically, it states that location matters, and where people live influence them heavily and affect their future life and how they will grow. In relations with communication theory, this affects what kind of newspaper will attract which readers. This is a very important study in newspaper, for newspaper heavily depends on circulation. Moreover, Darwinian theory can be applied to the growth of cities. And as presented in the text, as cities grow and prosper, newspaper has to change in order to adapt to this change and in order to gain more readers. Finally, as mentioned before, the circulation of early newspaper is similar to modern-day gatekeeping theory. Gatekeeping is when there is a gatekeeper who decides which information will be shown to the public and which will not. The disadvantage of this theory is that it can be biased, but it is necessary. It helps organize information for the audience to read. Basically, information that is thought to be important are passed through gatekeeper to the audience. Finally, the conclusion. Newspaper has went through dramatic changes throughout the history, and there have been different kinds of newspapers that were invented in order to adapt or respond to certain events in their time period. However, the modern newspaper has all of these features inside. The modern newspapers have evolved to be as sophisticated as they can be. Newspapers play significant roles in forming political institutions. In addition, good newspapers need to be objective, and current newspapers are. Moreover, there are still independent papers, party papers, and yellow journalism. However, all of these balance one another. Although centuries have passed and different kinds of media were formed, the importance of newspaper is unquestionable. The value that it has lays the foundation for all of the media that are used right now. If it weren't for the newspaper, there would not have been computer or internet or radio. The contributions that the Chicago School has made to this society is unquestionable and is still important in the present day. Thank you for listening to my presentation.